You believe you're safe, don't you? That you're merely listening to a story, comfortable in your chair, protected by the distance between you and what I'm about to tell. But Millbrook is not a place that allows itself to be imprisoned in words. It crawls, it infiltrates. And if you allow each sentence to take root, you might notice signs around you that were always there. Millbrook doesn't appear on maps. It never needed to. It finds those it desires, and when it does, there's no return. You've already opened the door. Now all that remains is to listen until the end. Dr. Sarah Chen had spent 15 years studying American folk traditions, but she had never encountered a community as isolated as Millbrook, Kentucky. The small town appeared in her records only by chance. A mention in 19th century letters about unusual agricultural practices that had caught her academic attention. When she finally managed to locate Millbrook on modern maps, she discovered it nestled in a deep valley of the Appalachian Mountains, accessible only by a winding dirt road that seemed forgotten by time. The 6-hour drive from Louisville took her through dense forests where cell reception gradually disappeared, as if technology itself were being filtered out by ancient vegetation. As her rented pickup descended into the valley, Sarah noticed the quality of light changing, becoming more green, more diffuse, as if being filtered through layers of foliage even in apparently open areas. The air also grew thicker, laden with an aroma of rich earth mixed with something sweet she couldn't identify. Millbrook emerged from the trees like a mirage of a lost American past. The houses were primarily 18th and 19th century wooden constructions, well preserved, but with a patina of age that spoke of generations living and dying in the same place. Main Street was lined with centuries-old oaks, whose branches intertwined overhead, creating a green tunnel that blocked most sunlight. There was a quality of silence in the town that Sarah associated with holy places, not the absence of sound, but a respectful quietude that made whispers seem like profanation. The first resident she encountered was an elderly man sitting in a rocking chair on the porch of the general store. He had white hair and faded blue eyes that seemed to have witnessed decades of seasonal changes. When Sarah stopped to ask directions, he studied her with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. "You must be the professor who wrote to Pastor Williams," he said finally, his voice carrying the mountain accent Sarah expected. "I'm Ezra Blackwood. My family's been here since the first settlers came down from these mountains." "Dr. Chen," she introduced herself, offering her hand. Ezra shook it briefly, and Sarah noticed his fingers bore small scars, as if they'd been repeatedly cut by thorns or sharp branches. "I came to study the region's agricultural traditions for my research on American rural practices." Ezra nodded slowly, as if processing information beyond her words. "Traditions," he repeated, and there was a weight to the word Sarah couldn't fully interpret. "Oh, we have traditions here. Some are older than we imagine." The church stood at the town center, a white wooden structure with a bell tower rising above surrounding trees. Pastor Williams was a middle-aged man with graying brown hair and kind eyes that seemed to carry the weight of unshared secrets. When Sarah introduced herself, he welcomed her with a warm smile, but she noticed his hands trembled slightly as he leafed through documents she'd sent in advance. The church interior smelled of old wood and something deeper, damp earth and a cloying sweetness. "Dr. Chen, it's an honor to receive you in our small community," he said, gesturing for her to sit in the church pews. The wood was polished by decades of faithful touch, and Sarah felt a strange sense of historical continuity as she settled in. "Your letters mentioned interest in our agricultural practices. I must say our situation here is quite unique, even by Appalachian standards. Through the church windows, Sarah could see the fields surrounding Millbrook. It was then she first noticed the strange patterns in the crops. Between normal rows of corn and tobacco were circular sections where plants grew differently, taller, denser, with a coloration that seemed almost bluish even at distance. The circles were arranged in a complex geometric formation, radiating from the town itself, as if they were part of a gigantic mandala carved into the landscape. "Do these circles appear naturally?" Sarah asked, pointing to the window. Pastor Williams followed her gaze, and his face assumed a solemn expression. "In a sense, yes. They appear every 7 years, always in the same places, always with the same form. Our community has learned to work with them over the centuries. It's part of what keeps us connected to the land." He paused, studying Sarah's face with a tension that made her uncomfortable. "You've come at the right time, Doctor. This is the 7th year." That night, Sarah stayed at the Millbrook Inn, a Victorian boarding house run by the Harper family for 4 generations. Mrs. Eleanor Harper was an elegant woman of 60, with silver hair pulled into an impeccable bun, and a manner of speaking that suggested refined education. "It's rare for us to receive academic visitors," she said, while showing Sarah to her second-floor room. "I hope our small town can offer the information you're seeking." The room was charming, with antique furniture and a window overlooking the fields behind town. Sarah opened the window to let in the night air, and was struck by a complex aroma-rich earth mixed with something sweet and slightly fermented, like overripe fruit beginning to rot. The fields stretched under the waxing moon's light, and she could see subtle movement among the plant rows, as if something large was slowly shifting through the vegetation. During the night, Sarah was awakened by sounds she couldn't fully identify. They were like distant chanting, multiple voices harmonizing in melodies that seemed ancient beyond human memory. The sounds came from the fields, carried by night wind through her open window. When she rose to investigate, she saw lights moving among plants in the strange circles. Not lanterns or torches, but a soft bioluminescence emanating from the plants themselves, pulsing in rhythms reminiscent of heartbeats. Human figures moved among the luminescent plants, but there was something hypnotic about their movements. They shifted in precise formations, like dancers following ancestral choreography. And when they occasionally passed through moonlit areas, Sarah could see they wore simple work clothes, but their faces held an expression of serene ecstasy that made her feel like an intruder observing a sacred ritual. Sarah breathed deeply of the night air and felt a strange drowsiness overtake her. She returned to bed without realizing she'd stood at the window for nearly 2 hours. The next morning, Mrs. Harper served an elaborate breakfast with local products that had more intense flavors than Sarah was accustomed to. The bacon had a deep, smoky taste, the eggs a creamy richness, and the greens a complexity that made her taste buds tingle. "All grown right here in Millbrook," explained Mrs. Harper with evident pride. "Our land has special qualities that make everything grow better, more flavorful." After breakfast, Sarah decided to explore one of the closer plant circles. The 15-minute walk took her through conventional fields of corn and soybeans, but as she approached the circle, vegetation began to change gradually. Plants became taller, more lush, and there was a quality in the air that sharpened her senses. The silence was also different, deeper, more expectant, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. The circle measured about 20 meters in diameter and was perfectly round. The plants within were of a species Sarah didn't recognize. They seemed to be impossible hybrids of corn tobacco and something resembling carnivorous plants. They grew in concentric spirals, all leaning toward the center, where there was an area of bare earth approximately 3 meters in diameter. When Sarah approached the center, she felt the soil beneath her feet begin to give slightly, as if composed of layers of decomposing organic matter. The bare earth at the center wasn't actually empty. There were small protrusions scattered across the surface, pinkish in color, resembling human skin more than any plant substance. One moved slightly as she knelt to observe more closely, contracting like a muscle. Sarah extended her hand to touch it, but stopped when she heard footsteps behind her. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The voice was gentle but firm. Sarah turned and saw a young man, perhaps 35, standing at the circle's edge. He had dirty blonde hair and green eyes that seemed to contain knowledge beyond his apparent age. His work clothes were covered in dirt, and his hands bore the same type of small scars she'd noticed in other residents. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen," she said, standing. The man nodded slowly, as if he already knew who she was. "Jacob Morrison," he replied, "and those things in the middle, they're still growing. They don't like being disturbed before they're ready." There was something in the way he spoke that made Sarah step back from the circle's center. Not exactly threat, but absolute certainty that there were consequences to ignoring his warning. "What are they?" she asked, genuinely curious. Jacob walked around the circle's edge, always maintaining the same distance from the plants. Sarah noticed they leaned slightly toward him as he passed, as if recognizing him. "Something that's been growing here a long time," he said. "My family arrived here 3 generations ago. My grandfather told me they were already here when the first settlers arrived. Maybe they always were." Over the following hours, Jacob guided her through several other circles, each unique in formation, but all following similar patterns. He spoke little, answering Sarah's questions with short phrases that raised more questions than answers. Sarah realized she was feeling strangely relaxed, despite the mystery of the situation. Her usual scientific anxiety in the face of the unknown was being replaced by a calmer, almost dreamy curiosity. In one of the older circles, Sarah saw plants that seemed to have characteristics challenging her botanical training. Some had structures vaguely resembling human faces. Others had extensions that looked like fingers or hair. When she mentioned this to Jacob, he simply nodded. "They learn," he said simply. "They observe. Then, they grow accordingly." As the day progressed, Sarah began to feel a strange lethargy. Her thoughts seemed slower, but at the same time clearer, as if she was seeing connections that normally remained hidden. Colors around her seemed more saturated, especially greens, and she could swear she could hear very low whispers coming from the plants. When she mentioned this to Jacob, he smiled for the first time since they'd met. "You're beginning to hear," he said. "Most people take longer." There was approval in his voice, but also something that might have been pity. "The air here is different during this time of year. It carries things, small things that change how we perceive the world." He stopped and looked directly at her. "You can still leave, if you want. Tomorrow will be harder. The day after tomorrow." But Sarah found she didn't want to leave. The idea of returning to her normal academic life, to her research in dusty libraries, suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the living mystery surrounding her. "I want to understand," she said, and the words came with more conviction than she expected. Jacob nodded, as if he'd predicted her response. When they returned to town at evening's end, Sarah realized her perception had changed. She could hear whispered conversations in the distance, could smell each individual plant they passed, could see subtle patterns of movement in the earth beneath their feet. At the inn, Mrs. Harper received her with a smile that now seemed to carry meanings she was beginning to understand. "How was your research today, Dr. Chen?" asked the older woman. There was something in her eyes, not malice but patient expectation, as if awaiting the unfolding of events she'd witnessed many times before. "Jacob is a good guide. He understands the particularities of our region." During dinner, Sarah ate with an appetite she hadn't felt in years. The food had extraordinarily complex flavors, and she found herself chewing slowly to savor each nuance. Mrs. Harper had prepared a salad with greens she didn't recognize, deep green leaves with a flavor, combining fresh earth with something slightly metallic. "Local vegetables," she explained when Sarah asked, "from our special garden." That night, Sarah wasn't awakened by chanting. She was already awake when it began, as if her body knew in advance they would come. This time, she went downstairs and left the inn, walking toward the fields. No one tried to stop her, and she suspected Mrs. Harper was watching from the window with silent approval. The chanting came from the plant circles, where dozens of figures moved in ritual patterns. When Sarah approached, they didn't stop or try to hide. Instead, they seemed to notice her and accept her presence as if she were an expected guest. People sang in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow understood words about growth, about the earth, about becoming part of something greater. Sarah stood at the edge of one circle, watching, and gradually began to understand she wasn't witnessing worship or ritual in the traditional sense. It was more like maintenance, care. People were tending to the plants, and the plants were tending to them, in an exchange that seemed as natural as breathing. When one of the figures approached her, Jacob, she realized, he extended his hand in silent invitation. Sarah took his hand and let herself be guided into the circle. The soil beneath her feet was soft and warm, and she could feel a subtle vibration, as if something large were pulsing beneath the earth. Plants around her seemed taller than during the day, their leaves glowing with their own light. When Jacob positioned her at a specific point in the pattern, Sarah felt a sudden connection, not just with the people around her, but with the plants themselves, with the earth, with something vast extending far beyond the circle's limits. For a moment, she experienced something her mind struggled to process. It was as if she could feel the consciousness of each individual plant, each root extending through soil, each leaf absorbing moonlight. But more than that, she could feel how they were all connected, how they were part of a larger network pulsing with life and purpose. It was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. The moment passed, leaving Sarah breathless and disoriented. Jacob helped her out of the circle, his eyes full of understanding. "It's a lot the first time," he said gently, "but it gets easier and clearer." He guided her back to the inn, where she slept deeply without dreaming, or perhaps dreaming in a way her conscious mind couldn't remember. The next morning, Sarah awoke with a strange sense of purpose. She knew, without understanding how, that she needed to see what lay at the center, not just the center of individual circles, but the center of everything, the point from which the entire network radiated. During breakfast, when she mentioned this to Mrs. Harper, the older woman nodded as if she'd been waiting for this progression. "The main garden," she said, "that's where everything connects, but it's also where things become permanent." She studied Sarah's face with maternal attention. "Are you sure you're ready? What you see down there will change you. There's no going back to what you were before." Sarah realized her answer was already formed before Mrs. Harper finished speaking. "I need to see why," she said, and the words carried a certainty she didn't know she possessed. It was as if some part of her had always known she would reach this moment, that her entire academic career had been merely preparation for this final discovery. Pastor Williams, Jacob, Mrs. Harper, and several other Millbrook residents accompanied Sarah in a solemn procession heading toward the woods behind the church. The trail wound through centuries-old trees, and Sarah noticed the air became progressively thicker as they walked, laden with that sweet aroma she now associated with transformation. The forest opened into a circular clearing, approximately 150 meters in diameter, completely filled with the most extraordinary vegetation Sarah had ever witnessed. Plants here had grown to impossible heights, creating structures resembling natural Gothic cathedrals. At the clearing's center was a depression in the ground, from which emanated a pulsing green light. "It's almost time," Jacob murmured, and Sarah realized all the residents seemed to be awaiting some kind of event. As they approached the center, Sarah saw the depression was actually an opening, a tunnel descending into the earth's depths. The opening's edges were decorated with plants growing in complex geometric patterns, like living arabesques. The tunnel walls were lined with organic material that pulsed softly. Enormous roots intertwined along the walls, all converging toward the depths. Sarah could hear something like heartbeats echoing from the tunnel's bottom. When Pastor Williams gestured for her to descend, she felt no fear, only strange anticipation, as if she were finally going home after a long journey. The descent lasted what seemed like hours. The tunnel deepened in gentle spirals, always expanding. Sarah began to see humanoid forms partially integrated into the organic structure. people who had chosen something she was beginning to understand. Their faces were serene, and when she made eye contact with some, she felt waves of emotions that weren't hers: peace, completeness, joy. The tunnel finally opened into a cavern of impossible proportions. At the center rose a structure, defying classification. Part tree, part nervous system, part something her mind struggled to comprehend. Its surface undulated with bioluminescence, and Sarah could see faces appearing and disappearing in its bark, not trapped, but dancing. "Welcome," said a voice that seemed to come from all directions. It was a harmony of human voices mixed with nature sounds, leaves whispering, wood creaking, water flowing. "You have found your way to us. Are you ready to become complete?" Sarah extended her hand toward the pulsing structure. When her fingers touched the surface, she felt an explosion of sensations, not just hers, but from hundreds of others who had made the same choice. She could feel the earth breathing, could hear each leaf whispering, could experience the pure joy of growing, of being part of something infinitely greater than herself. 6 months later, Professor Michael Harrison arrived in Millbrook to investigate Sarah's disappearance. He found a thriving community where Sarah, apparently, had decided to stay to continue her research. When he met her, she seemed radiant with health, with a vitality he'd never seen before. Small vines grew in her hair like ornaments, and her voice had a new musical quality. "Welcome to Millbrook, Michael," she said, extending a hand that had small leaves sprouting from the fingers. "You've arrived at the perfect time. The next harvest is approaching." Michael felt a strange compulsion to accept the extended hand. As his fingers intertwined with Sarah's, he began to hear gentle whispers in his mind and wondered why it had taken him so long to find this extraordinary place where people had learned to live in perfect harmony with something much greater than themselves. In the Earth's depths, the network grew, slowly spreading through underground routes to neighboring communities, not by conquest, but by invitation. After all, who could resist the promise of becoming part of something more perfect, more complete, more connected with life's very essence? And the network continues growing, not by conquest, but by invitation. Tell me, when the promise of belonging whispers in your ear, will you resist? And before you ask yes, there are signs that you've been chosen. The first is fascination. The second, repetition. If at the end of this story you find yourself thinking about Millbrook more often than you should, it's because the roots have already begun to work. There's no point in running. Some doors, once opened, never close.